This is the story of the enchanted land. There once was a time when people and fairy folk lived in peaceful harmony, crossing into each other's worlds quite freely. But then one day a new king came to the throne, and he was obsessed with conquering and combining other kingdoms so that his own empire became bigger and more powerful. As his kingdom grew and grew, the king still wasn't satisfied and wanted even more powerful things, and he thought that the fairy folk had just such things. Although human people could cross over into the enchanted land and the fairy folk into our world, neither would interfere with the other's business. Whereas human people would war against each other, the fairy folk did not. They were very much at peace with one another. The fairy folk could live for a very long time and had magic, so really they had everything they needed. None of the land in which they lived was owned by any one fairy, elf, pixie, or sprite, but instead they had a council of elders to keep order should such things get out of hand, though they hardly ever did. The king was very envious of the fairy folk. He wanted to live for a very long time and to have their magic, for he believed that if he had their magic, he could rule the whole of the human world. He thought with magic every battle would be easier for him to win, and if he had such a long life, then he would have time to conquer everywhere and more time to enjoy his rewards. The king's envy grew and grew. He simply must have the fairy magic, but he knew he could not get it by declaring war against the fairy folk, for they had magic and could slow down human time and the power to speed theirs up. The fairy folk could cut all the bowstrings before an archer could load the bow with arrows. They could turn all the swords into dust at the click of a finger. But aside from that, the fairy folk had the best archers you could find anywhere. They never missed their targets. The king decided that he would go and speak with the council of elders and persuade them to let him have the fairy magic. The king gathered some of his best men and rode into the enchanted land. Once there, the king saw an elf sitting on a rock, staring back at the group of riders. The king called out in a most commanding voice, "I want to speak with the elders."
"You can't,"
replied the elf.
"They don't sit until the next full moon."
The king flew into such a rage, just like that, and said, "I want to see them now." The elf suddenly disappeared from sight, found a thin willow stick, and whipped the king's ear with it. "Ow!" cried the king, but before he could say anything else, the elf laughed and replied,
"You can't till the next full moon."
Then the elf vanished again. "I'm going to gut that sprite," shouted the king. "It's more than a week away till the full moon. I'm not going to wait that long." The king and his men rode on until they found a little cottage. The king ordered one of his men to knock on the cottage door, and a tiny woman opened it and said,
"How can I help you?"
"I demand to see the council of elders," replied the king.
"Oh no, I'm afraid you can't,"
replied the little woman.
"They don't sit till the next full moon."
The king's face went red, then purple, and finally blue with anger. The tiny old woman said,
"It's no use getting upset, dear. You will simply have to wait. And besides,
You will have to let them know that you are coming." "How am I supposed to do that if I can't speak to them?" said the king. The tiny woman replied, "Why, you must just write them a letter, of course." "And who am I supposed to give it to, and where am I supposed to send it?" said the king. "You don't give it to anyone," the little old woman laughed. "You just burn it, and then you get your reply." "What?" shouted the king. The tiny woman replied, speaking very slowly this time, "You just burn it. Do you have ink and parchment?" The king and all his men looked at each other in amazement and shrugged their shoulders. "Here, I will get you some." And she went back into the cottage and returned with a quill and parchment, then handed it to the king. The king wrote a letter asking for a meeting and handed it back to the tiny old woman. She took the letter from him and put it on her fire. The letter went up in flames. It turned black, with hundreds of bright, glowing sparks all over. And then the letter broke up, and the sparks flew up the chimney. The tiny old woman said, "There, it has been sent. You will have a reply soon," and closed the door on the king's face. The king and his men turned around and rode back home in total silence, for they did not know what to say. The next day a letter appeared on the king's desk. No one had delivered it. It had just appeared there. But it was from the fairy folk's council of elders, naming a time and place for the next full moon. The day before the next full moon, the king and some of his men rode off once more for the enchanted land to meet with the fairy folk's council of elders. The king stood in front of the council of elders and said that he wanted their magic and he needed a long life, as the human world would be better for it. The elders spoke to each other in a language that the king did not understand. Then one of the elders stood up and said, "This will never happen. It was written in the law of stones. It is because of the greed of man that humans shall not possess magic, or a long life, or indeed anything from our world. Your people have wiped out giants, trolls, orcs, and the dragons are all but gone from your world. What shall it be next? The wolves and bears?" "But they attacked us," cried the king. "They only attacked you because you did not let them live on the land that they had the right to. The law of stones also warns that if humans ever did get magic, they would want the enchanted land too, and that there would be nothing to stop them." "The answer is most definitely no," called another of the elders. The king flew into such a rage he threatened the fairy folk that if they should ever come into the human world again, he would kill them all. And from that day magic was to be banned from the human world. The king stormed off, shouting and kicking at whatever he could, be it the ground or a rock. The council carried on with their meeting, and came to the decision that all the gateways must be closed between the enchanted land and the human world. The gateways have stayed closed ever since, but because the fairy folk live such a long time, they can still remember that day. Mind you, it doesn't stop them coming into our world to play tricks on human people occasionally, and sometimes a gate might even be left open.